Now, prior to 1995, no mortgage banker wanted to originate a loan that didn't meet those minimum standards because you couldn't offload it and sell it on the secondary market, and so you'd need to warehouse it. It was a landmine. It was just going to eventually, you knew it was going to blow up on you. You didn't want to make a loan to somebody with no money down, poor credit, and where they did not have enough income to be able to buy that house, because you knew that loan was going to go delinquent. It was going to go sour. It was just a matter of time. But once Fannie and Freddie said, if you originate them, we'll buy them so you can go out and make more of them, we created a pipeline for this. We turned it into a business. And with that, the home ownership rate started to rise. The next thing that had happened was that one of the unintended consequences of lowering interest rates after the terrorist attacks of September the 11th, and I'm not criticizing that decision, it was an appropriate time to panic in our economy. If you remember, the economy was shutting down after 9/11, piece by piece. We were watching it. And so then Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan made the decision to reduce interest rates dramatically to try to stimulate economic activity. It was an appropriate decision. But those interest rates stayed very low for a very long time, long after the economy had recovered and was back to running on all 8 cylinders. What that did was that artificially corrected the house price affordability that we had lost going from 92 to 2000. Think about this. From 92 to 2000, house prices went up by 33%. Income only went up by 14%. We looked at that earlier. So what that means is that most people had been priced out of the market, and it was time to cool. But when you lower interest rates, you artificially rebalance that equation. In fact, the math on interest rates is that for every 1% decline in interest rates, a borrower can afford to spend 9% more on the house that they're looking at without their payment going up by a single dollar. That's just the power of that interest rate swing. So when interest rates fall by a percentage point, a $300,000 buyer can afford to buy a $327,000 house, 9% more, put all of that $27,000 in purchasing power into their mortgage principal, and although their mortgage principal has gone up by $27,000, their payment hasn't changed a nickel. Well, we saw a 3% drop in interest rates during this period, which meant that we had added in 3 times 9 is 27% of purchasing power to consumers, to home buyers, and suddenly price was not a problem. When you combine all the demand that was coming from subprime, which was increasing demand, coupled with very low interest rates, which made houses relatively cheap, what we did was we added fuel to that fire. The next thing that happened around 2002 was that Wall Street was looking for a place to move its money because the stock market had collapsed with the tech bubble in '99 and 2000 and early 2001. There was a lot of money sitting on the sidelines and looking for a place to go to be able to generate rates of returns. And what happened was capital started to come into the housing market looking for rates of return because it was the hot spot in the economy. And then finally, what happened is the icing on the cake began in 2004 and ended out to 2007. What happened was private equity and the too big to fail banks figured out that they could do a better job of generating return rates by completely bypassing Fannie and Freddie and creating their own entirely private funded loan origination networks where they were funding the mortgage, packaging it into securities, selling it to investors, and completely bypassing Fannie and Freddie, entirely a private system. That meant it was outside of government regulation, and Fannie and Freddie looked at that and said, unless we compete, we won't be able to generate our own profits. And under George Bush, Fannie and Freddie were instructed to double the number of subprime loans that they were purchasing on the secondary market in order to be able to chase rates of return and be more profitable. It was also thought, both in the Clinton and Bush administrations, that increasing home purchase activity would be a long-term net gain for the US economy because people would be living in houses and building equity, because it would generate construction jobs and employment, and it would generate all of the peripheral retail spending that happens when home buying is taking place, because when homes are being sold, there are appliances like refrigerators and washers and dryers and dishwashers and microwave ovens that are being bought, which means they need to be manufactured, and that's good for companies like GE. You've got construction jobs and lumber and all the suppliers that are doing well. You have retail spending on furnishings and carpeting and things of that nature. It was thought that this would be a good long-term strategy, a net gain for the US economy. What we know today is that instead of house prices cooling in 2000 and slowing, that we instead saw a continued escalation in house prices. In fact, the house price rise accelerated beginning in 2000 when it should have been cooling off and leveling and adjusting downward. And so from 92 to 2000, we ended up with a 94% increase in US house prices. Here in New Jersey, it was 220%. And we only had a 10% rise in household income. Clearly, we had built a house of cards that was unsustainable. And from 2000 to 2005 alone, check out these numbers, house prices rose by an additional 46% after going up by 33% during the 8 years before that. US household income was actually declining. Imagine that. We had house prices go up by half, but pay was going down during an economic expansion, a good time in the economy. What the heck was going on there? I can tell you what was going on. It was the beginning of this new reality that we'll be dealing with long after this recession has been recovered from, which is that the US economy, US businesses, more importantly, US workers, were no longer competitive in the worldwide economy in terms of the cost to business per employee to be able to produce goods and services. It was the beginning of that offshoring of jobs. We didn't feel it yet because we had such tremendous access to unlimited credit that we were spending ourselves into a drunken stupor, but it had already begun. Income was already falling. And over the long term, what we're going to see here is that US income, the rise in US income, will underperform what's happening in the rest of the world long term, whereas in the past, we were outperforming. Now, how did that happen? Essentially, the collapse of the Soviet Union during the Reagan years was an epiphany for the rest of the world. Because when the Soviet Union collapsed, and we were all sort of cheering that on, today, the leading economies in the world, which are called the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, they watched that USSR meltdown, and they immediately realized that they needed to change their game plan. That if they stayed on that socialist, communist tilt, that it was going to fail. They'd never be able to accomplish their economic goals. And what they immediately started to do in the 1980s was to study our economy. They sent their best and brightest here into the United States. That's why when you hear that the president of Egypt today studied and received his degrees here at US universities, that was a worldwide phenomenon. They came to our country to learn what we were doing right in the economy. And our approach all through that time period was to be so boastful and to tell everybody that they should be more like us, that eventually they were. And what these countries have done was they analyzed what we were doing right, and they immediately began to implement it into their own economies. Now, we still do things better than they do, but what they know how to do is to build things faster and cheaper. And that's the economy that we're in here today. And with that, we've lost our competitiveness. What it costs a company to produce things here is about double what it costs to produce the same product somewhere else. And with that, we've lost some of our competitiveness, and it began to show up right here. Of course, home builders watched all this happening, and one of the tenets, one of the premises of economics is that profits encourage competition. If someone's making money selling hamburgers or hot dogs or pocketbooks or shoes, and they're really doing well, profits bring competition. Someone else says, I'm going to do the same thing. Looks like it's a good business model. Another corollary to that, though, is that excess profits. If you're making a whole lot of money, you will attract ruinous competition. The market, so many people will go into that business that it'll become oversupplied, flooded, saturated. And home builders jumped in on that and overproduced the market by 4.3 million houses. New construction production was exceeded historical levels from 2000 to 2005 by 4.3 million houses.